Welcome back to another episode of the Educational AD Podcast, brought to you by Violent Defense. Violent Defense is dedicated to protecting our world from germs by bringing the power of UV disinfection to everyday spaces. Their patented technology enables them to harness the power of the sun to incorporate ultraviolet light into products and environments like never before. Whether you're ready to implement existing products, or if you'd like to explore researching and developing a custom deployment of their technology for your school, Violet Defense has the solutions and the experience you need. Thanks again to Violet Defense for sponsoring the Educational AD Podcast. Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the Educational AD Podcast. Today we have some podcast royalty, celebrity, if you will, Dr. Mark Rerick. Mark is a certified master athletic administrator. He's the athletic director for the Grand Forks Public School System, very active on the national level, serving on committees, and obviously very active at state level. He's also one of the hosts, probably one of the founders of, I think, the podcast that started it all, the Off-Duty ADs. Mark, welcome to our podcast.
Yeah, thanks, Jake. It's good to be on here. I think you're going to need to lower the bar on what you consider royalty, though, if I'm included in at that level. But I certainly appreciate the intro.
As you and I talked a little bit before we came on, always enjoyed listening to you and your partners, and hopefully you guys will be able to continue that down the road. Well, like most podcasts, we always like to let our listeners have a chance to get to know our guests. So tell us a little bit about yourself, where you grew up, where you went to school and college, and maybe how a love of sports led to this career in athletic administration.
Yeah, born and raised North Dakota, and I've ventured around the state, but not outside the borders. Actually combined my love of sports pretty honestly. My parents got their first teaching job in a tiny little school in North Dakota, and started there in August. And my twin brother and I were born in September. And my dad, just quintessential small school teacher. He was teaching high school math. He was a head football coach, assistant basketball coach, assistant track and field coach, and then assumed the summer baseball program also. And when I say small, I mean small. I always I giggle a little bit when we're at the national, and you're talking to people who say, I grew up in a small community, about 40,000, 50,000. My small community when I was there was 1,200. It's probably closer to about 600 or 700 now. So it was tiny and really kind of in the middle of nowhere. So, there was no, running to a bigger town or anything. It was pretty enclosed. So, those of us that were around our age group really had the run of town. A handful of boys our age, of course, I had a twin brother, which helped. And I had a dad with the master key to the school and to every athletic facility in town. So, my mom taught kindergarten, and the building, and actually where I grew up is a K-12 building, elementary on one side, high school on the other. So, really about the time that my twin brother and I got to school, we would finish our school day on the elementary side and we'd just walk over to dad's practice on the high school side. And so, I grew up at football practice. We weren't quite as involved at the basketball practices in the winter, or even track in the spring. And then of course, dad was our coach in the summer. And so a lot of my love for sports came from that. Very literally, my dad was my first coach because he was our Little League baseball coach, and he was my last high school coach. In fact, my senior year of high school, he was head football, head basketball, head track and field. So, he was the only voice I had, but that was all we did. I mean, there was no, we grew up in the middle of pheasant country, and there's a lot of hunting and stuff that goes on out there, but we didn't do any of that. We were a 12-month sports family, and that's what we did. So I packaged that. I went to a small NAIA school in North Dakota, had the opportunity to play 4 sports there. And so I ended up spending, I'm a double major. So I spent 5 years there. Was a part of 15 athletic seasons throughout 4 different sports through my time there. Finished up, got a job teaching and coaching in a small North Dakota school, spent 9 years there, moved into administration, went across the state to the west side of the state for 2 years as an AD and assistant principal. And that was really how I really got into the athletic director world. My last 4 years at the school where I was teaching and coaching, I spent time as the AD, but a really small school. And so being an AD there, really just meant creating the schedules, schedule the buses, find somebody to be your PA, make sure your officials show up, and that's it. I was convinced at that point that I was going to be a principal. And so when I started looking for admin jobs, I found one across the state in a larger school, a Class A school in North Dakota. And I took it because of the assistant principal piece, and it came with athletic director. And I was there for about a month or so before I realized I really loved being a full-time athletic director. Started getting a little more involved in our state organization at that point. Was fortunate enough to have knowledge of Hall of Famer Ed Lockwood. And Ed was the one who nudged me into the national scene. And I was out there 2 years, and then, former NIAAA president Todd Olson, who was in my current chair, took a job 70 miles south in Fargo, which opened up the job in Grand Forks. And that was 10 years ago, and here I am. So, that's it. I was born into sports, and I haven't left. I've been here ever since.
Yeah, I always love to hear the stories. And again, if you do things long enough, you end up checking a few boxes in this position. But much of my career was spent in schools just like you described. I did grow up in a small town, but we had an enormous school district that drew from a lot of different areas. But the town the school is in is very small. So I remember those days. And then you mentioned 2 names, Ed Lockwood and Todd Olson. Todd and I both came on the certification committee at the same time, a long time ago. I got to know him. And then Ed Lockwood continues to work with certification. I'd certainly call him one of my mentors. So it's great to have those commonalities. Let's go and jump into that mentoring question. In our profession, we always talk about the importance of leadership, and particularly mentoring. So I'm curious, who are some of your mentors? I'm going to guess your dad's probably up there at the top of the list, but who are some of the other voices that you still hear in your head today?
Yeah, it's interesting. I got into teaching and coaching because of my parents, and like most teachers, they spent our childhood growing up telling us not to get into public education, and here I am anyway. But as a coach, my dad was certainly my first mentor. It's interesting how much that's shaped my views as a dad now. I have 4 boys at home, ages 4 to 15, and I'm very conscious of how I treat them, I guess, as a dad and as a coach, simply because growing up, dad's voice was the only voice that I had as a coach. And fortunately, I liked being coached by him. It worked well. My dad is an old school coach. He was, in terms of pushing my twin brother and I, Dad was very quick to point out what we were doing wrong. We were mentally strong enough competitors where it wasn't like we ever questioned our worth. We just knew that, Dad as a perfectionist, as a coach was going to nudge us towards fixing the things that were wrong. And it worked really well for me. Fear of failure has really kind of always motivated me, even probably more so than being successful, just not being crappy, right? But I was very aware, that his voice was the only voice when I got to college. And in my freshman year of college, I played football, basketball, and baseball. And I was fortunate enough, I played on the offensive side of the ball for football, and our offensive coordinator was the head baseball coach. And I got along and still get along really, really well with him. We changed head football coaches my second year, and then I had the same basketball coach for 5 years. But all of those guys were different, valued different things, spoke in a different way, motivated in a different way. And I latched on to certain aspects of all of them. And really it was at that point that I became aware that, as I was in high school and I was in junior high school growing up, I mean, I was really motivated by this one thing, and it was one voice, and thankfully it worked for me. Had it not, I probably would have struggled as an athlete. And so, as a dad, now I try to apply that to my kids. I actually make a conscious effort to not coach my kids with their youth stuff, because they're going to hear it from me in the backyard anyway. And I want them to hear different different voices with their different sports. So, but all of my college coaches, applied something to me. I had a great superintendent when I was a first-year teacher. So in terms of just true leadership and providing autonomy with structure, was really big. My superintendent would really let you do your thing. He would tell you when you were getting to the edges, but was not a micromanager, put a lot of trust in the folks that worked for him. And then once I got into the AD world, especially when I got into bigger schools, it was some of those names that I've mentioned. A real big one for me was Jim Hausler, who was the AD in Bismarck High School for years and years. Because North Dakota is a small state, Jim was actually a basketball official for my high school career. And so I knew him from that. And then all of a sudden became a colleague and instantly related to him. Ed Lockwood, in terms of mentorship and getting involved in the NIAAA, my I guess kind of first thing with the NIAAA was on the 5-year strategic plan 2 plans ago. And my involvement on that was when Ed bumped into me at an NDI AAA meeting and said to me, I offered your name for inclusion on the NIAAA strategic plan, and you're going to do it. So let me know how it goes. and that was it. I was in. Then my other major involvement, I guess, is on the publications committee, where I'm the vice chair right now. Set to become the chair when Bill Fitzgerald is done in 2023. But my in with that was local also. Craig Perry, who worked for the Minnesota High School League and was on publications, had pulled a couple things from a blog I was writing at that time and submitted it to the publications committee. And then when he finished his term for Section 5, I stepped into his role. And Craig and I had a connection because he was the Grand Forks AD before Todd. So, it's all pretty circular that way. But, all of those guys would have some influence on what I'm doing now. And of course, Jake, like you now, being so involved at the national level, I mean, you take so much from all of the people that you see, the folks that you're on committees with, the folks that you see with committees passing by, the board members you get a chance to talk to, certainly Mike and Phil in the office. I mean, and every conversation, every interaction, whether it seems benign or not, you pick up something, whether it's a new touch on philosophy, whether it's a new way to file things. I mean, it could be something huge. It could be something stupid and small. But it's just amazing once you get involved with athletic directors from all 4 corners, how much you can take from every little interaction. And so, a really wide-ranging answer for you there, but it's I think the influence on me as an AD is growing. Really, as my involvement is growing.
No, I appreciate you going into that depth, because it actually took us into what was going to be the next talking point about how you got involved with NIAAA and the state association. As I always say, the young athletic directors, they'll go to their first state conference or their first national conference, and they'll see people like you and me that have been doing this for a while, and just kind of wonder, well, geez, how do you get to that point? Well, it starts locally. You volunteer for that first committee, you start taking LTI courses, and you just end up getting sucked in by drinking the Kool-Aid. So no, that's I'd love to hear those stories about how people got involved and how they continue to help others, both locally and globally. So great stuff. For listeners, we're visiting with Dr. Mark Rerick, Certified Master Athletic Administrator and the Athletic Director for the Grand Forks Public School System. We're going to come back, but we're going to take a quick break and hear from our podcast sponsor, Violet Defense. Violet Defense is dedicated to protecting our world from germs by bringing the power of UV disinfection to everyday spaces. Their patented technology enables them to harness the power of the sun to incorporate ultraviolet light into products and environments like never before. Whether you're ready to implement existing products or if you'd like to explore researching and developing a custom deployment of their technology for your school, Violet Defense has the solutions and the experience you need. Thanks again to Violet Defense for sponsoring the Educational AD Podcast. Welcome back, everyone, to our conversation with Dr. Mark Rerick, Grand Forks, North Dakota. Mark, you've been around for a while. You've been at some different schools. And one of the things that we try to do with this podcast is the idea of sharing best practices. So I'm going to put you on the spot. As you look at your schools and the programs that you provide to kids, what are a couple of initiatives? Maybe they're even things that you have developed, but what are a couple of things that when you look at, you can say with equal parts pride and humility, boy, we do this better than anybody else. What are some best practices that you can share with us?
Yeah, I think one of the things that I try to be very conscious of here is the placement of athletics within a tax-funded public school system. I know there's different funding models across the country, but for our schools in North Dakota, we are dependent on general fund transfers, from our tax base, and so we really have to make sure that folks see the value in what we're doing. One of the things that I talk about with my coaches all the time is, if all you're doing is teaching skill scheme strategy, then we're not meeting the purpose of educational-based athletics in a public school system, particularly one that's tax funded. Because, and other ADs have said this too. You hear people talk about this. We can't do that as well as the clubs that can wholly focus on skill scheme and strategy. So, if all we're doing is coming out and teaching kids how to dribble, shoot, defend, and rebound, we're already behind the eight ball, because we just flat out can't do that as well as a club can, that can choose kids based entirely on their basketball ability. So one of the things that I do with my courses is we try to highlight that higher purpose, and I'll talk to them about, I forget the exact numbers off the top of my head here right now, but 60% of high school graduates stay within X number of miles of where they graduate, and so we tell people, like, look, most of our kids who graduate from Grand Forks Public Schools are going to stay in the area. So what we teach them and how we teach them and how we get them from being kids to fully functioning adults is going to reflect on our community in the future. And if all we're doing is teaching kids how to dribble, rebound, and shoot, we're not helping out society a whole lot. I'll jokingly say at that point, especially the rebounding, because those of us that have played, Wednesday night men's league basketball, there's no rebounding anyway. So that's not a lifelong skill. So we try to intentionally teach some of those other things. So when I got to Grand Forks, they were in the beginning stages of a program called Coaching Boys into Men. It's run through a group called Futures Without Violence, and it's a national group that was looking for some pilot programs, and this was in the works when I got here. It really just needed my stamp of approval, but absolutely got it, and we've been running with it since. But Coaching Boys into Men is a curriculum-based program that we implement as a part of our practices. It's really designed to teach boys how to relate to people, how to talk to people, how to interact with people, what being an adult male should look like in society. And there's some things that are keyed towards the group that does it, Futures Without Violence, is really keyed in on domestic abuse, dating violence, things like that. And so there are units within that curriculum that are specific to that, essentially trying to get away from, the stereotypical toxic masculinity, right? This is, this might be how you think a 16-year-old boy is supposed to talk to girls, but this is how a 16-year-old boy should actually talk to girls. And the whole curriculum is kind of built around that. And so it's not, specific to dating violence. It's also, here's how you interact with adults. Here's how you interact with peers. Here's, what your behavior in the public should look like, et cetera, et cetera. So we've been doing that for 9 years. The national group came up with a parallel female curriculum. It's called Athletes as Leaders. That's about 4 years old. And we were given the opportunity to jump into that pilot. We did it without thinking, 2 feet in. And so, I don't force that on my coaches. I'm someone who believes, if you force those things on, it can actually be detrimental. I have some coaches, if I told them that they had to do the coaching boys into men curriculum, I have some coaches that would stand in front of their groups and say, oh, I guess we're supposed to do this now, which now you're accomplishing the opposite purpose, right? So we provide it. We have a lot of coaches who use it. And so we'll try to meet the higher purpose that way. The other thing that we've done here over the last few years, I'm a really strong believer in intentionally teaching the things that you want. And I think one of the things that we don't do very well in educational-based athletics is intentionally teaching characteristics. We're all real good about saying, hey, sports teach character, and our kids are going to learn how to be timely, and they're going to learn accountability, and they're going to learn respect, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But we're not teaching that. What we're doing is we're modeling it, we're patterning it, and then we're expecting the kids to do it. And we might hold them accountable for it, right? During a basketball game, if a kid drops an F-bomb, or if we see him talking back to an official or whatever, we might sit the kid. Or whatever the consequence might be. But I go to the other end of it. Have we intentionally taught that kid how you're supposed to interact with officials? Have we intentionally taught that kid what being a good teammate looks like? And so what I've tried to implement with my coaches over the last few years is a set of core values. And we let our teams pick those on their own. And they're pretty wide ranging. We have some teams that will choose them based simply on a characteristic where the core value, it might be persistence and respect. We have some that will use little aphorisms. I have a golf coach who's really, really good about this, and his core values are, we will be brave. It's stuff like that. We will be positive. We will be a team. Those are his aphorisms. But then we go one step farther with our coaches, and our coaches come up with ways to intentionally teach those things. So if one of your core values as a team is that you will be brave, how are you going to teach that to kids? And so he comes up with active ways, both on the golf course and off, that you can be brave. What does being brave look like on a golf course? Well, sometimes it means being aggressive. Right? If you want to take that 5-wood and hit it out of the fairway bunker, this is what being brave is. If that's your best shot selection at the time, be brave. Take a shot at it. And as a coach, then he has to be very careful about, I'm not going to get down on this kid, right? If she duffs that shot, if she dinks it, if she buries it, if whatever it is that goes wrong, as long as he knows that this was her way of being brave and attempting this aggressive shot. Yep. And so, okay, this is what happened. Now, what's the next thing that we do? But then we take that outside of sports also. What does it look like to be brave in school? That might mean sitting in the front row. That might mean volunteering for projects. That might mean answering questions when teachers ask. That might mean sitting at a different table at lunch, right? Find the kid that you've noticed is sitting by herself all day long and grab a golf teammate and go over and sit with her. Being brave, we talk to some of our boys about things like this, being respectful, being brave. It means if you see someone, getting bullied, getting shoved around in the hallway, being strong enough to be the one who stands against the group, but intentionally teaching those things rather than expecting them. And so I guess, I have the advantage being a district AD of also being my own building level AD. And so I have the ears of all 41 of our programs to try to be able to create this umbrella. And so when we talk about core values, it's not specific to just one team or to just one school. We're trying to use that language across the district. And we've actually created a little bit of social pressure around our teams that aren't very good about it right now. Where kids who are multi-sport athletes are able to come back and say, hey, we've got a, great set of core values, and Coach whoever does a really good job of teaching these in the fall, wondering why we're not seeing some of that in the winter. And then I can lean on our coaches, right, and say, hey, look, we've got parents saying, hey, you're doing a nice job teaching, dribbling, shooting, and rebounding, but they're looking for more. What can we do for more? And then again, tying all of that back to that idea of being a tax-funded public entity. So when the time comes for us to justify our programs to the school board, to the public, to John Q. taxpayer, we can say, look, I'm teaching things to our athletes that they're not getting anywhere else. You're not getting that in math class. Our math teacher, he's got his or her hands full teaching math. And of course, we expect the kids to behave and all that, but we've got this platform in athletics to intentionally teach these things. And that's something that I'd like to think that we're doing pretty well here. We can certainly get better. We've got coaches that aren't very good about it. I've got coaches that are trying that we can do some tweaks. We've got folks who ignore me altogether. In fact, I just had a conversation with a coach yesterday. And I told that coach, like, we have flat out got to get you beyond skill, scheme, and strategy, because you are running a club program underneath our high school umbrella right now, and it's not good enough. I mean, it's not good enough. And, we're in a pretty substantial budget crunch here right now. And so I was able to even mention that to the coach. It's going to be really tough for me to justify your program if the school board tells me I've got to cut a program, because what you're doing could be done by the club. And so, we could get better, but it's something that I'd like to think that we're doing pretty well is, sports can absolutely build character, but let's teach that. Let's teach exactly what we think that should look like.
I just love both of those programs that you mentioned and the whole theme of being intentional. We're going to do this at the end of the show, but if one of our listeners wants to reach out and pick your brain on some of these ideas, what's the best way they can get in touch with you, Mark?
Yeah, my email is probably the easiest way. My email is it's mrerick230, so MRERICK 230 at mygfschools.org, schools with an S. But yeah, just shoot me an email. The other way that you can find me, our district website is gfschools.org. And then I'm sure in the NIAAA portal, I'll come up in the members section there also. And it's all the same email. So mrerick230 at mygfschools.org.
Yeah, I was going to mention it is up there on the NIAAA portal. Great stuff. Again, that whole intentionality thing, one of my, mantras, just as a general statement with our coaches and our programs for years, has been, everything you see when you walk in the door, when you go in the locker room, when you're in the gym, you're on the field, everything you see, it's either coached or it's allowed. Which one is it? And, those initiatives that you talked about, take that, base idea and say, okay, this is how we're going to be intentional about it. Just love it. Great stuff. And I love your comment about rebounding in the old man's league. My high school coach gave me this 100 years ago, talking about, it wasn't me, but one of my teammates was, we're watching old film, and the ball came to him off the backboard, and he said, "Coach, that's a rebound. You didn't give me credit for that rebound." And he goes, "You have to leave the floor for it to be a rebound. That was simply grabbing a loose ball."
Yeah, I like that.
Let's take this idea a little bit further of being intentional. We've been doing this podcast now for a little over a year. Still got a long way to go to catch up with you guys. But one of the questions that I've been asking revolves around this idea of social awareness or social justice. And this is my question. What are some things that we can do as athletic administrators to do a better job of being socially aware? I think you kind of hit on some of that in your previous answer, but, taking a laser focus on this theme, how can we do a better job in this area?
Yeah, to me, I think the biggest part of that in our athletic populations is inclusion. I think that, within the world of athletics, because athletics is so highly valued in society, and of course that filters down to high school. Each high school has its team, right? Whatever your team is. So here it's hockey. Grand Forks, for folks that know the hockey world, Grand Forks is the home of the University of North Dakota. Which despite what the folks across the river might say, is the single best collegiate hockey program in the nation. And so of course that trickles down to our high schools. And so hockey is king. And one of the things that we've tried to get our high school hockey teams to understand is, you've got to work your tail off and you've got to increase your skill and all of those things if you're going to make our varsity roster. But understand that, your exceptional talent in hockey isn't that different than somebody else's exceptional talent in music or in drama or in math or in, whatever. And so one of the things that we're working with our kids is getting them to understand that being a varsity athlete doesn't exclude you from the general population. So if I can give you a real brief example, I'm again using one of my hockey teams at one of my schools. Our varsity hockey program has a history of really being exclusive, to the point where, the one that really sent me over the edge a few years ago, they were having the snow days, spirit days at school, and the school's colors are red and black. And, one of the days it was Sea of Red Day. And so everybody was encouraged to wear, school gear in red. And our varsity hockey program showed up to school that day, and they were all dressed in their travel gray sweats. And then the next day, we actually played a rival basketball game the next day. And we really struggled to get our hockey kids out to support other athletes. We've really been working on that the last few years, and had our rivalry basketball game against crosstown school. And again, this same varsity team showed up in travel sweats. So they identified themselves as members of the hockey team, but then sat separately from the student body, and would wait until our cheerleaders started a student section cheer, and then they would start their own silly nonsense over the top of it. And so, readily identifying themselves as members of varsity hockey and then bucking the curve. And so when I say inclusion, this is one of the things that we've been working with all of our varsity athletes, is just saying, look, your talent exists within the athletic world, but understand that everybody has a talent, whatever that is, and it all exists. And so, can we get our kids to be more inclusive? Because what we really believe in is, if we can get our kids to understand that they're just a small piece of this large population, it becomes a lot tougher to exclude yourself from that population. And once you've excluded, or once you're included in that population, when there's no more exclusion, it becomes a lot harder to point fingers. And whether that's, you get into the, stereotypical definition of bullying, or finger pointing or whatever, well, if you view yourself as a part of that population, that doesn't happen anymore. Right. I mean, and you and I, before we started recording, and, I was kind of joking about red state, blue state a little bit. And, there's obviously a massive divide in our nation right now between those folks that are red, 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 and those that are blue, blue, blue. And it's because you're able to identify yourself as a red or as a blue, and then you can point your finger at the other color and say, you are wrong. And so to a much smaller scale, that's what we're looking at in our schools. We don't want kids to identify themselves as athletes and as non-athletes, and then being able to point your finger at the other group and say, well, you're a knucklehead jock, or you're a useless, John Q student. We want our kids to include themselves in the general population. And so, we are all members of this student population. We all have our strengths. We all have our weaknesses, and really try to build acceptance that way.
Yeah, gosh, as you're sharing that story, I was, going back to a similar situation I had at not my most recent school, but another one where, we just had a team that the student athletes were just, at that point in their lives, they just weren't very nice people. And it took us a couple of years to really, we just had to cycle them out through graduation and develop some leadership at the JV level and beyond. I remember talking with some parents, how come nobody comes to our games? Your kids aren't that popular. Okay. So that's tough. And, again, you hit it nail on the head, is, having those coaches in place that, have bought into the system, that share those values and want to promote those values with the kids. That's the key. Great stuff.
If I can interject on that real quick too, because I think there's, we can all, if you've been in this long enough, you can all, list a group of kids coming through that fits that mold, right? It's a bad group of kids, or on the other side, it's a great group of kids. And one of the things that I really like about intentionally teaching some of these characteristics, or intentionally teaching some of these leadership skills, is that you're always prepared for the year after that. The year after those kids are done, whether they've been awesome or whether not. And, real quickly, the year that really kind of enlightened me to this, when I was teaching and coaching, I was fortunate enough to win a state championship in football. We had a senior group that came through. I had 10 kids in the senior class, which for our school was big. I had 10 senior football players, and they were all outstanding human beings. They were intelligent, they were dedicated, they were hardworking. I mean, they were, help little old ladies across the street type kids. I mean, A students. I think back now. I mean, I think two of them are doctors. I think three of them are engineers. One is a business guy, owns his own farm. I mean, they were great. And what had happened in our small little community, I mean, these kids had been great forever and ever and ever and ever and ever. And, so for the 2 or 3 or 4 groups of kids behind them, all they had ever been told for their entire lives is do what those guys are doing. You didn't have to think about the decisions you were making, just latch on to this group of kids. And worked great for us the year we won the title. Everybody latched on to this group of kids, and we all did our jobs, and we all did it well, and we all worked hard, and we had a really, really good team. The next year, athletically, we were as talented, but all of a sudden I found myself with a roster full of kids who didn't know how to lead. And entirely our fault. We'd never taught them. We had never taught them how to lead. We had taught them. We had spent at that point really 16 years teaching these kids how to follow. I mean, we had intentionally taught them how to follow. That's all we'd ever said. Do what Andrew's doing. Do what Bill's doing. Do what Jake's doing. I mean, that's all we had ever said. And now all of a sudden, oh crap, these kids don't know how to lead. And so it's another reason that I like it, intentionally teaching this now, because you're not, when you do that with your full roster, you're not just teaching your leaders, you're teaching your whole roster. And, could my guys who came afterwards have led in the same manner? No, but they would have found their own niche, and they would have at least had the skills to do it. But that year afterwards was a struggle for that reason, because all of a sudden we're policing behavior, and we're policing motivation, and we're policing effort, and everything that we had never worried about because we hadn't taught it. Which is really just another reason, again, to intentionally teach those things early and often.
Now, again, it comes back to that intentionality, or as I like to say, it's either coached or it's allowed. Okay.
Absolutely.
Mark, we've been doing this for a long time, you and I in different parts of the country, but, our paths really haven't crossed that much. And it's really been great to get to know you just a little bit today and hear about some of the things that you do at your school. But we're not done yet. We always like to wrap up with what we call the athletic director's toolbox. You're certainly a experienced AD and award-winning AD, but right now I'm going to put you on the spot and challenge you to send out a brand new athletic director on their very first job. But I'm only going to let you put 3 things in their toolbox. What 3 items are going to go in Mark Rerick's athletic director toolbox?
To think back to when Mark Rerick became a first-time AD in his community, when I was thinking about your toolbox question, obviously I think as you listen to me ramble here, I'm really big on philosophy of why we do things more than just the mechanics. So all 3 things I have are philosophical, and I think it's things that once you've been in this business long enough, we all get to eventually. But I think all 3 of them are scary for new ADs. So for new ADs, the first suggestion that I'll tell them is care less, but with empathy. And I say care less because, we're in the business of education, and, we are here because we enjoy kids. And you get into coaching and you get into being an athletic director because you love sports. And when you love kids and when you love sports, you really, really get tied to the individual outcome of each kid. And I think that really tends to cloud our judgment sometimes in administration. I think that there are times that we're creating far more gray area than needs to be. And I think that really makes our jobs difficult on a day-to-day basis. And so my suggestion to ADs is always care less, but do it with empathy. So care less with empathy. Understand that the decisions that you make need to be the best decision for your full program. And sometimes that decision is going to hamper a kid. Sometimes it's not going to be the best thing for an individual kid. It might not be the best thing for an individual team. But in doing that, you have to remove yourself as an administrator from that narrow window. You've got to remove yourself from each individual item to be able to look with an umbrella over your whole program. So number one is care less with empathy. Number two, and my guess, Jake, is you've heard this 1,000 times, but number two is own your time. Be in charge of your own time. And to me, that's everything. I mean, ADs, just because you get a text message doesn't mean you have to immediately respond to that text message. Just because you get an email doesn't mean you need to immediately respond to that email. You have to be in charge of your own time. And I tell my coaches, and I weasel out a little bit with texts, I'll tell them, thankfully, Apple hasn't come up with a way for you to mark texts as unread yet, right? So you check that text and you lose the little notification. And so, what I tell my coaches is, you might send me a text, but if I need to keep that as part of my to-do list, I might not respond. So that's the excuse I give them, but in reality, I might just not be responding. I tell our coaches, look, I've got a wrestling coach who I really enjoy very much, but his mind is on his wrestling season for 12 months a year. And I mean, 24 hours a day, 365. I mean, it is constant. And so, in the middle of, June at 9:30 at night, I might get a text from him for a thought that he has for our late December wrestling tournament, and I tell my coaches, send it, because I understand that part of the coaching world. Send it. If that's when you think of it and you need to get that off your, send it. But as an AD, I'm going to own my own time. I'm not going to respond to you at 9:30 at night. And I think about this with everything. I mean, when you return calls, when you do your daily tasks, when you do your long-term tasks, I mean, own your time. Figure out what schedule works best for you. And do that. The last little piece about this, and this is for young ADs, in terms of owning your own time, you have to learn to be okay not having the last word. Because, if you're in an email discussion, if you're in a text discussion, especially with an angry parent, that angry parent is always going to say one more thing. So at some point, you got to just drop it. I mean, at some point, just drop it. And it took me a while to get to that part of owning my own time. But I very rarely get the last word in discussions. I'll let somebody vent something, and then I'll just ghost it from there out. I won't say anything. So there's my second one, own your own time. The last one, and this is probably the most difficult one for me, but be human. It's okay to be human. It's okay to be vulnerable. It's okay to be wrong. It's okay to not know something. All of those are okay. I think what happens especially for young ADs, you become in charge, and we think that part of being in charge is that we have to know everything and we have to be able to solve everything. And you forget that you're a human being, you're a person. I liken this to being a homeowner. Just because I'm a homeowner doesn't mean I know how to fix everything around my house. And there are things that go wrong that I can do right away. There are things that I'm going to have to check YouTube real fast, but I'm fairly certain I can figure it out. There are things that I'm smart enough to just call somebody else. And it's the same thing being an AD. The other part about just being human in this role is understanding that, you're in the driver's seat. I mean, you have power, you have control. And so it's okay to tell a parent that you don't know an answer, because they can't do anything without you anyway. So just tell them, I don't know, but I'll figure it out. If you screwed something up, tell them, yep, I screwed it up. I'll do better next time. Because at the end of the day, and I know this hurts, right? I mean, this hurts if a parent knows they're right and you're wrong. I know it hurts, but you're still in the driver's seat. I mean, you're still the admin. You're still in control. You still have the power on your side of the table. So it's okay to be human. If you don't know something, admit it. If you screwed it up, admit it. And then just always guarantee that you'll get better in the future. And then, of course, work towards getting better in the future. So there's number 3 for you. Just be human.
Oh, gosh, I'm sure you saw me writing all those down. Those are great ideas. And again, talking about, a parent wants to get in the last word. I'm sure you've heard this before. A parent comes to your office or calls you up. Did you know? And then proceeds to describe something that you have no idea. And so I go, well, no, I didn't know that. Thank you for sharing. And I'll get back to you on that. But yep. Oh yeah, just great tools. I appreciate that. And obviously those are going to be in the second edition of the Athletic Director's Toolbox. So
there we go.
Mark, one more time, if one of our listeners wants to reach out to you. And I encourage you to do so. What a wealth of information. What's the best way they can get in touch with you?
Yeah, again, my email is mrer230@mygfschools.org, mrerick230@mygfschools.org. You can also, if you message me on Twitter, I'll get it that way too. I'm not very active on Twitter, but I do check it every day. My Twitter handle is @Dr. Rerick, CMAA. So I would get messages there too. But if you shoot me an email, I'm pretty good about keeping track of that and responding to those. I'll own my time, so it might not be immediate response depending on what I'm doing, but I'll get back to you pretty quickly.
Okay. For our listeners, we're recording this on July 22nd, so it's pretty timely information while you're listening to it. Mark, this isn't on our list of questions, so I'm ambushing you here. What are the chances that we're going to hear some more episodes of the off-duty ADs down the road?
It's a great question. We took a lot of pride in being really the first podcast to this space for high school athletic directors. We had talked about, what our podcast would sound like and what it would look like really for about a year until we finally got around to launching it. We knew that timeliness was going to be a big piece of it. We had a list of topics that we wanted to get through to begin with. And we knew, in our world, in the AD world, if you're not including current events, your topic list is pretty finite. Eventually you can get to it. And there was a lot. I mean, we hit 150 episodes or whatever it was. What we weren't anticipating was the difficulty in scheduling all three of us on a routine basis when we're working around 9 kids. And so what we had run into was our personal and professional schedules and the coordination for that. And, the amount of time that it was taking us to record, the amount of time it was taking me to edit and to publish, and what that was taking away from really from our families. And then kind of a coordination of what happened, our podcast became less timely, which then of course puts more emphasis on the topic because you learn, you lose current events. And then we found ourselves spending the first 20 minutes of our get-togethers trying to decide what we were going to talk about. And so the short answer to your question, Jake, I don't know. I mean, we didn't shut it down. Our episodes are still live. If you go to off-duty ADs on your podcatcher of choice, all 151 are still there. They're still there for consumption. They're still there for listening. I still monitor our Twitter and Facebook accounts. I still monitor our email accounts. So we're fairly responsive. It certainly exists. The other thing that, the three of us are all pretty good in our professions about expanding, and Mike does a lot with coaches education. I've had a blog that's still up and running, youthsportstuff.com. I haven't written on it for about 3 years, but everything is still live there. I mean, there are other options to possibly get into this space. I'm hoping to use that time to get back into more writing and again, providing young ADs, providing colleagues with usable stuff. So that was a really long way for me to avoid your question, Jake. I don't know that we'll get back into it, certainly not for the foreseeable near future, but it's not entirely off the table.
Well, again, I apologize a little bit for ambushing you, but to Mark's point, the podcast episodes are still out there and still some really great content. So if you have not checked, I encourage you strongly to check out the Off-Duty ADs podcast on all of the podcast carriers that are out there. Mark, great stuff. Are you going to be at the state coordinators meeting in September in Indianapolis?
I will not be. I am. That is actually not one of my roles here in the state. One of the few things that I haven't taken on. So the next time that I hope to be visible on the national scene will be at our national conference in Denver in December, and I'll be out there early. Publications committee meets before the conference, so I'll be out there early. ADs listening, I teach 719, which I've been teaching for I think 7 years now with Daryl Nance. Daryl's one of the Hall of Famers in our organization. I mean, what an outstanding individual. And so I ride his coattails. But 719 is the leadership course. It's an outstanding class. We're actually adding 2 new instructors to it for the first time this December. Former President Andy Childs will be a part of our faculty, and Dustin Smith, who's really starting to get involved in our organization here also. So just a great group of instructors. So if you're looking for something to take out there, 719. I also run the Blue Ribbon panel, and so I'll be in and out of rooms all through December. And like I said, we take something away from every interaction we can with colleagues. So listeners out there, if you see me, come up, say hi, let me know who you are, where you're from. I'm a good small town North Dakotan, so I know how to shoot the breeze for a little bit. We'll find some common ground somewhere.
Well, again, thanks so much for being on our show, and let's definitely make some plans to share a beverage or two in Denver. Okay?
Can do that. I hear they have a brewery or two out there.
Okay. To our listeners, thanks as always for tuning in. Remember, the Zoom recordings of these interviews are being uploaded to the Educational AD Podcast YouTube channel. Thanks again. Come back again for another episode of the Educational AD.